Hi, my name is Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, and I'm a professor of photography at the University of Rhode Island. I've taught here for over 20 years, and I've also was a past director for the URI Center for Humanities and a recipient of the Sylvia Chandley Professorship in Peace Studies and Nonviolence. When I started teaching here at URI, I was teaching darkroom photography or analog photography, but I've moved now into digital, and what's exciting for me is that every year what I teach is different from the previous year, so my 2 decades at URI haven't been static. So one of the projects that I more recently have focused on is about the 2.5 million Indians who fought for their British colonizer in World War II, but are barely acknowledged in South Asia or globally. And I've done 3 different installations of this work. One is about their stories, where on my second Fulbright to India, I went and collected crowdsourced photographs from the different families who had ancestors who fought in World War II. And I took those family photographs and using laser technology made these 3D crystals of the photographs, which are in the installation with archival footage and an audio talking about their life experiences. Because of my background in technology, I'm very fearless about using new tools and finding ways where the final presentation of the work dovetails with the concept that I'm trying to portray, and that's something that I try to do in the classroom too. In today's world, everyone is a photographer. We all have phones in our back pockets. And so one of the first things I tell my students, the analogy that even though we all speak English, we still take English classes to better construct our sentences to communicate more clearly. And the same way through a photography class, you can learn how to put that frame together to get your ideas across. So this is my recent monograph that came out in December of last year. The pre-sales of 500 copies had to happen for the book to go into print. And when I saw the names of so many of my past students who had bought the book, it was really, very touching as a professor to still keep in touch with my past students from 20 years ago.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Lapointe, and on behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to our program today. We're happy to present the first discussion in our Fall 2023 Faculty Office Hour series. In recognition of the 75th anniversary of the College of Arts and Sciences, we are going to take you on a tour of the fine arts, including art, music, and theater. Today, we welcome Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, Professor of Photography in the Department of Art and Art History, for our discussion. And acting as moderator of the discussion is Mary Beth Riley-McGreen, a digital content strategist in URI's Department of External Relations and Communications. If you have questions for Professor Matthew today, please post them in the Q&A section on your screens, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. And just a quick note, today's program is being recorded. In a few days, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording. You'll also be receiving a very brief survey from us, and we do welcome your feedback. Now, I'd like to invite Mary Beth Riley-McGreen to introduce Professor Matthew.
Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here today and to have so many of you join us. As Karen mentioned, this semester, the Faculty Office Hours series concentrates on the arts, namely photography, music, and theater. And today I am very pleased to introduce you to Professor Annu Palakunnathu Matthew. She is a professor of photography in the Department of Art and Art History at URI. Her photo-based work draws on old photographs to re-examine historical narratives in the United States and South Asia. Though trained as a photographer, her work increasingly uses the ever-expanding digital toolbox. She has had recent solo exhibitions at museums in Canada, New York, and here in Newport, Rhode Island. She has exhibited work at many other notable museums, including the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Smithsonian. Her essay on the unremembered Indian soldiers of World War II was recently included in Ars Orientalis, the journal from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art, and her monograph, The Answers Take Time, was published in 2022. Professor Matthews earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Madras, India, and later received her master's degree in photography from the University of Delaware. In addition to her current position at URI, she has been director of the Center for the Humanities and the Sylvia Chandley Professor of Nonviolence and Peace Studies. And now it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Matthew to join me on screen for today's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Beth, Karen, and your whole team. Okay, take two. So I'm going to start my presentation by giving you some context and then walking through some of the projects and process. I'm an artist who draws on archival photographs to re-examine historical narratives and the legacies of colonization. I'm also an artist who has lived between cultures, three cultures, and hence I'm both an insider and an outsider. I was born in England, and this is me as the first Indian Virgin Mary in England, and then grew up in India and now have lived in the United States for over 20 years. Living between cultures also gives me a different perspective, which is what I try to do in my artwork, to change perspectives. As an artist, I'm especially interested in human stories and why some histories are lesser known. I was a math major in my undergraduate, and in India, you have to choose your major before going to college, and I couldn't change it. And I can go into that story in the question and answers. But the only good thing about my undergraduate was that I took a photography class through the physics department, and my memory was there was about 15 students, 2 rolls of film, and 1 camera for the whole semester. And just creating those 2 images turned me on to photography. I started as a still photographer, and the first cohesive body of work I made was called Memories of India, which I started right at the tail end of graduate school. And in this body of work, I captured the gestures, the smells, the sounds that remind me of my home culture. And for this work, I used a $20 toy camera, partly because the plastic lens creates vignettes on the edges and distorts the edges, like a memory is slightly distorted. But also because of that math background, I wanted to use a very simple toy, but by understanding exposure, create beautiful images. Plus, no one takes me very seriously when I'm walking around with this plastic camera. When I started photography, I thought I wanted to be a photojournalist and go back to India and fight for women's rights. But I don't have the personality for that. I was influenced by my early childhood in England, where I grew up in a less patriarchal society. But when I arrived in India at age 10, I was suddenly made extremely aware of the gender disparity. And so, though I don't have the personality to be a photojournalist, I found a way that I was comfortable with to talk about the issues growing up as a woman in India. And what I did is I took photos of the posters that are on the walls of India. Bollywood is one of the biggest movie industries in the world, and it's very melodramatic and over the top. And so these posters just lend themselves to satire. And with very early versions of Photoshop, I manipulated the statements to make my own feminist statements. So this reads, it may have started as a good idea, but now it's a price tag. The dowry system is illegal in India, but it continues to go on. And it started because it was a way for the woman to have a portion of the family property when she leaves the family when she gets married. But now it's become more like a price tag. And father, whose pet name is Kunyuti, and you can see the name right at the bottom of the screen, he didn't take a dowry over 40 years ago, so there was no way that I was going to pay someone to marry me. this reads, I have to decide now whether I'm going to spend the rest of my life with him. Mrityudand, which means death sentence. So I had had relationships and knew over time that I didn't want to marry these people. So how was I going to meet someone once and decide if I was going to spend the rest of my life with them? To me, it felt like a death sentence, which is one of the reasons I came to the United States to study photography. And here you can see the original poster with on the right with the changes I've made on the left, directing the viewer's eye to read the message that I'm trying to convey. So when I show this to younger audiences now, they tell me that I was making memes before I knew what they actually meant. Don't play in the sun, you'll get dark, no one will marry you. Fair and Lovely is actually the name of a lotion that a lot of women in India use to try and get fairer. And this statement was actually told to me as an aunt when I moved back to India. So you can see images of myself as a child, along with the images of Indian movie actresses who look almost Caucasian. So now there's actually a cream for men called Fair and Handsome. So I, want this work to be seen by a South Asian audience. It's been shown in museums and galleries, but I've also put it back on the streets in India so that people read the message and usually hurriedly walk away. I also had a show at Smith College, and so we had it on the buses that went between the 5 colleges so that a larger audience saw the work. There's also movie theaters in the United States that show Bollywood movies, and I've had my images as slides, as advertisements before the movie starts, so it's seen by a captive South Asian audience. Moving to another project, about 5 or 6 years ago, I started To Majority Minority to highlight stories of immigrants who don't look typically, quote, American, unquote. To push back and resist the rising anti-immigrant and minority sentiment as the America of yesterday, filled with immigrants of European descent, is giving way to a new multicolored and multicultural America. As an immigrant minority and an American citizen, I'm triply aware that I and many others don't fit into the historical stereotype of what an American is supposed to look like. This is simultaneously a personal and communal project, having experienced prejudice as an immigrant and watching the experiences of others. A recent example is of Giselle Barreto Fetterman, the wife of Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. She's lived in the US for 32 of her 40 years, but is still not considered American. So I'm going to show you a 1-minute photo animation, and this is Thuan's story. She was a child when her family fled Vietnam. It all starts with a family photo. I go into these families' homes and go through their family photographs, which brings back a lot of memories. And then we decide on one of the photographs to collaborate with.
in Mexicali,
And then I interview usually the grandparent, and the grandchildren are hearing some of their stories for the first time. I obviously scan the photographs.
Okay.
And then I collaborate with them to reenact the old photograph. And usually the family helps
I think
by
that's
holding
good.
the reflectors.
Oh, daijoubu, mamacita. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I also create photos of the whole family, so they have something to put back into their house. And then I put these contemporary photographs that I created back into the original photograph to then create the photo animations. And if any of you are photographed using Photoshop Magic. When we first arrived, my mother and I didn't fight about grades. Only about folding clothes and vacuuming. My mother told me not to worry about money. She said we'll ask Oprah if necessary. So I show the work in different ways. One is projected in a space. Another way is I've created a 3D printed book that mimics the look of a passport. And so inside the 3D printed book is an iPad Pro that plays videos. Open Wound is about the children of the partition of British India. I did this work on my first Fulbright to India in 2012. During the partition, over 15 million people were displaced in just 3 months, and over 1 million died. The partition was one of the most violent periods in the 20th century, only exceeded by the killings during the 2 world wars. For someone who grew up in India, associated in my mind with Gandhi, nonviolence, and yoga, this creates a strange disconnect. In my project to tell the stories of the children of partition who are now in their 80s and 90s, my aim is to collaborate with my subjects to create work that is accessible to a larger audience by using their family photographs. What happened to them should not be lost to history. So this is the Kohli family story. I went from being wealthy to a penniless refugee. My father went back after 2 years to his home at Lakshmi Mansions, flat number 39. The person living there had a British mother and a Muslim father. The man asked if he would like a cup of tea. When my father said, when I was served in my silver tea service with my monogram on it, I realized that I was homeless. So this 90-second video shows you the different stages I go through with collaborating with the family and collecting their stories.
ये पापा ये नाना जी की that's my grandfather, but I can't find my great grandfather and my grandfather's brother's wife.
Okay.
And it starts before any other wedding function.
Okay, that's
So that's how many
yeah.
dress.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very unusual for someone to wear a lehenga on a wedding.
इसलिए वो पुरानी दुकान में अच्छी तरह की लाइट है फोटो में जैसी लाइट है ना नई फोटो की वैसी पहले की फोटो होगी जो ये जवान थे अब शायद आगे and then they shifted to that Mehroli house वहाँ they have the found some gold
Just show them what you did.
I walk into these strangers' homes and they open up to me. We initially bond by looking at their photo albums. This is one of the strengths of photography, the power to trigger memories and shared storytelling. I present the work in a hollowed out 1947 encyclopedia with an iPad mini inside. As University of Pennsylvania professor Dr. Bhakirathi Mani pointed out, the act of hollowing out the book is a metaphor for the violence that happened during partition. After completing the work in India in 2015, I was awarded the Sylvia Chandley Professorship in Peace Studies to expand this work to include the stories of partition from Pakistan and Bangladesh. I wanted to explore multiple perspectives on partition. I think this interest comes from someone who's lived between cultures. I am Indian, but I'm also aware that there is other sides to the story that needs to be told. Unsurprisingly, the stories were very familiar and similar to what I'd heard in India. If anything, they included more graphic information. So this is Abdul Halim's story. My mother never told my father what happened. She said because he never asked. She never spoke about losing a child. My father said that he didn't want to know how she was saved, and there was always a stigma about women who survived. My mother told my wife how my sister died. She was given a choice to choose between my sister or me, but couldn't make one. It was decided for her. So in the installation of Open Wound, on the left is in the book are the stories playing from India, and on the right are from Pakistan. And you can see the screens changing. And in the background is a haunting video called Harayat of a place that was scarred by partition. But there are also issues with memory and oral histories. As Urvashi Bhattalia, author of The Other Side of Silence, a book of oral histories with survivors of the partition, eloquently wrote. Oops. I would like to ask if there's a way in which people's stories, notwithstanding all their problems, can somehow expand and stretch the definitions and boundaries of history and find a place in it. As an artist, I take that license, which is more difficult for a scholar to justify. So now moving to the unremembered Indian soldiers of World War II. I find it staggering that 2.5 million Indians' contributions in World War II as the largest volunteer army in history are barely acknowledged in India or globally, especially as World War II was truly global with pivotal conflicts in the European, Pacific, and Asian theaters. For the 2018 Kochi Musri Biennale Commission, I focused on the Indian soldiers who fought in the Italian campaign. One of the reasons was because the Battle of Monte Cassino was pivotal in winning the war, and the Indian troops played a critical role. I projected archival footage of these Indian soldiers fighting in Italy onto their gravestones in Italy at dusk and dawn. This was in Cassino and in Forlì. We crept in and out of the graveyards, and on the last day, the last hour, the police arrived. I was petrified, but luckily my husband pointed to me and said, "Indian artist," and the Italian policeman said, "Indian, no problem," and took a photograph with me. So this clip is a clip from the final installation. So on the day of the biennial opening, my friend Yamini sent me a photograph of her grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Chakravarti. What I loved about this photo is that you can connect to the person versus just a headshot. So it sent me down this rabbit hole to crowdsource photographs from these Indian soldiers and tell their families and tell some of their stories. And this resulted in my second Fulbright in 2019. And in the final installation, I have projected film onto sarongs that Indian men wear, which is edited from all 3 theaters. And then the photographs I've made into 3D laser cut crystals that are in the space. So this is a clip from that installation.
My grandfather was one of these soldiers. He contracted cholera at the war front in Assam in 1943 and was shipped back to Kirki, where he died 12 days before my father was born.
My father wrote home, sending photos and postcards of the murals and sketches he made. It was his way to shift his thoughts from the atrocities and hardships of war and retain his humanity.
So I'm also aware that some of these people do not have family photographs. So I scrolled the names of some of the 87,000 plus Indians who died, along with their age, position, and parents' name, making the viewer aware of the range of positions that these men held and the socioeconomic differences. So from collecting these photographs, I came across a number of Indians who were prisoners of war and were captured in Libya and then taken to Italy. And when the armistice happened, these camps were left unattended, and a number of Indians escaped and were sheltered by Italian families at the risk of their own lives. And this is one of those stories. Lieutenant General Culler left his wife of 6 weeks to fight in Libya, and then was taken to Avezzano, where he picked up a smattering of Italian and managed to escape during the armistice with his friend Sandu. Fabriano Domenico and his wife Ada sheltered them till the war was over. It was over a year. And they advised Kala, who was a Sikh gentleman, so they never cut their hair. He advised him to cut his hair so that he could pass as Italian, which he did. And they continued to their friendship until Kala passed away. They also corresponded in Italian for decades. I was just in Italy 2 weeks ago, where I presented on my work on the Indian soldiers, but also was joined by the descendants of some of these families. And so the person on the bottom left is the great-grandson of Fabriano, who joined me to tell some of the stories from the Italian perspective. And so that's where my future work is going. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, because one of the big topics right now is about artificial intelligence and how is that going to affect photography. I think the field will be affected, but it also can be looked at as a tool. So this is a photograph of the old prisoner of war camp in Avezzano, and I was trying to show what the place looks like now. And you can see this is from an early test, but there's a lot of reflections in the black on the sides. So using artificial intelligence, I expanded the canvas of the image, where using AI, it actually fills in that tree, and so that I was able to get the shot that I was hoping for. You can see here now the reflections are much less, and I was able to get the image. So, there are ways that AI is going to change the field, but there's also ways that one can embrace technology to use it in new ways. I'm going to end with a very early project titled Fabricated Memories, which has now come full circle. So this work is about my memories of England, where I was born. I had the opportunity to live there 3 months after graduate school. And so I decided to photograph my memories of England like I had my memories of India. But when I came back to the US, the only thing that reminded me of England was my father, who had died exactly 20 years ago. So I created this small handmade book where I inserted family photographs into these contemporary photographs, but made them look like fabricated memories. And the small handmade book fits into a Chesterfield cigarette box because my father died from complications connected to smoking. And in this space, actually, there's also tobacco scent, so it's a very sensory experience. And the text in the book talks about our questions whether I would have made the same choices to become a photographer if my father was still alive. What I was really struck by was that when my book publisher, Michelle Dunmarsh, sent me the book dummy for my book, The Answers Take Time, the cover included an image from this very early project, because she recognized that the thread of trauma and loss is the thread that goes through all my work. And this monograph has been mentioned, came out last December, and is still available on Minor Matters Books website. And the links are on the right. So you can see that my work has evolved over the years. I started with a still photograph, moved to collage, and then diptychs, to the photo animations, and now installations. And that's also how I approach my teaching. So I want to end with the two student pieces. This is a music video created from archival footage, was done in my Photography 1 class, which is a basic photo class, where we collaborated with students from Dr. Emmett Good's music class. And Emmett will be giving a talk later on in the series this semester. And I was really struck by the powerfulness of what the students came up with, which has resulted in me teaching a class called Art for Social Change. So let me play this.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
Is anybody here see my old friend Abraham? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but the good they died young. 'Cause I looked around one day and the man was gone. What a shame he was gone.
So I don't want to end on a down note, so I'm going to play this very short stop motion video, which is done as a technical assignment, again, in my Photo 1 class. And in just less than an hour, these two students, Hannah and Jackson, were able to put this video together. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties.
Thank you very much, Professor Matthew. That was an amazing presentation. We have time for a couple of questions. One that I wanted to follow up on, as you noted in one of the last slides you showed, you've chosen different mediums for your different projects. You've projected onto headstones, you've created crystals, you've created collage. So I guess it's a two-part question. One is, how do you choose the stories that you're going to, elevate and explore with your art? And then how do you choose the form they're going to take?
As an artist, most artists only talk about the projects that are successful, but there's a number of projects or ideas that I have that don't manifest itself into a finished body of work. So it's those stories or ideas that resonate with me, that stay longer with me, that I continue to pursue. And there's a lot of research that goes into the work. So if I don't get bored of the research, it means that I'm really interested in the stories. And, some of them also, especially some of the war things that I'm doing now, also resonate with what's going on in the world. I mean, that these prisoners of war were sheltered by Italian families. One hopes that humanity is continuing to happen. But in terms of the process, one of my philosophies is that the technique has to dovetail with the concept. And so I always try to find a particular technique where it will kind of make that idea stronger because of the technique I'm using. And that's often with trial and error. I don't always know the technique when I'm starting the project. That evolves as I start either collecting the materials, creating the materials. And then, for example, the fabricated memories, I put together the family photographs with the contemporary images, but it took 2 years to figure out that it was going to be a book, it was going to be Polaroid transfers. And so that takes, the technique usually takes longer to figure out. But I don't want to use technique for technique's sake. And so it has to combine seamlessly with the idea that I'm trying to portray.
And you dovetail quite beautifully into my next question, which is, would you explain further about fabricated, reconstituted, reimagined memories?
Yeah, I think memories are a complicated thing. I mean, first of all, in terms of photography, when you press that shutter button, the image you've created is already a memory. It's already part of the past. And so photography lends itself to being strongly linked with memory. But as we know, my memory of an incident would be quite different from somebody else's memory of that same incident. And so there is distortion, there is forgetting of certain details. But then I also think, especially with trauma, there's certain details that are kind of embedded in your brain that you can't forget. And they may not be of historical significance, but I think that art can play that role to create that curiosity about a particular history by telling some of these stories for people wanting to know more and reading more about it.
And as someone who has looked at this work, the effect is a kind of transcendence, to see how you are taking, as you mentioned, much of your work thematically is concerned with loss and sorrow and trauma, and you have taken those themes and created stunning art. So
thank you.
I just wanted to acknowledge that. The very last question, because I know we're running up against the hour. What have these different projects given you as an artist?
Oh, that's a good question. I think when I started my work, it was more about my own story. And being an immigrant, living between cultures, and as my work has evolved, it's enabled me to maybe elevate marginalized stories. And so it goes back to my earlier interest of being a photojournalist, where you're trying to again show a different perspective. But it's allowed me to, I think, follow the interests because I think my work is socio-political, to follow those interests, but find a way to process that visually that I'm comfortable with and that hopefully the audience will also engage with. And to me, that's deeply satisfying as an artist.
I can imagine. Well, thank you, Professor Matthew, and thanks to everyone who joined today. As mentioned, within the next few days, you'll receive an email with a link to today's recording, along with a few recommendations for further reading and listening. We hope you'll join us again in November on the 15th for a conversation with Dr. Emmett Goods, who Dr. Matthew mentioned. He is an assistant professor of music. And thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.